The roots of the mob warfare and bloodshed of the 1980s can be directly tied to Atlantic City and the passing of the Casino Gambling Act. Running the Philadelphia La Cosa Nostra family at the time was longtime Philadelphia mob boss Angelo Bruno. Known as the Gentle Don, Bruno knew he was no match for the New York families who had their eyes on Atlantic City, so he declared that this traditional Philadelphia territory was now open to any LCN family, a move that would eventually contribute to his murder.
He was very astute in recognizing he might as well give them permission, these other families, to come in rather than risk the incurred wrath and the resulting gang warfare, or merely these other mobs muscling in. So he declared Atlantic City an open city. That certainly created a backlash within the members of his own mob, which contributed to his eventual assassination.
Filling the shoes of Bruno would be his underboss, Phil Chicken Man Testa. Testa's reign, however, would come to an almost immediate halt less than a year later when he was killed by a bomb that was planted on the porch of his South Philadelphia home, planted on the orders of his very own underboss, Petey Casella, who had reportedly thought with the boss out of the way, he would rise as Testa had to the top.
And that was Petey Casella's hope that once he was free from Testa as the boss and being the underboss at that time, that he would naturally rise to the top. Of course, that never happened. There was quite a backlash against Casella.
A backlash that would eventually force Casella underground, creating a void in the mob's leadership. A void looking to be filled by Testa consigliere Nicky Scarfo. Scarfo set out immediately for New York to seek the necessary approval of the ruling commission there. But exactly what was it that this capo, banished to Atlantic City, had to offer that made him so confident of their approval?
The main factor was that Scarfo's organization was already in place here. He ruled the resort's rackets from these two apartment houses at 26 and 28 North Georgia Avenue, Scarfo's home. But to understand how Scarfo became mob boss, we must go back to a time when he had just been released from jail for killing a longshoreman. Angry at the young mobster's temperamental carelessness, mob boss Angelo Bruno banished him to a new ball and chain, Atlantic City. The year was 1963. The world's playground was in a state of decline. Yet Scarfo managed to thrive at the seashore in bookmaking, loan sharking, and illegal gambling. When gambling was legalized here in 1976, Scarfo was ready. He controlled the iron and concrete workers' unions and even formed his own concrete company, Scarf Inc. 5 casinos employed Scarf Inc. and also knowingly employed a large roster of non-existent employees, but in return had no union labor problems.
The mob will get involved in a union to be in a position to be able to exercise that choking point and force the casino into doing whatever it is that they want them to do.
Scarfo also controlled Local 54, the hotel and restaurant employees union, the most powerful in Atlantic City. Its president, Frank Gerace, associated with Scarfo. Gerace's mother even lived in Scarfo's apartment house. Casino management recognized Local 54's Mafia ties.
Business agent did not have to walk in and say, I'm the mob. He just had to walk in and say, I'm Local 54. They knew who he was, and I have a company I want you to do business with, and the message is delivered, and if there was a way that it could be done, it was done.
Little Nicky also proved his power in 1980 when he, Phil Leonetti, and Lawrence Merlino were charged with the murder of associate Vincent Falcone. Mobster wannabe Joe Salerno, a brigantine plumber, witnessed the killing. Fearing for his own life, he turned informant.
We tried the case, but we were not able to convince the jury beyond a reasonable doubt as to the guilt of the defendants based on the uncorroborated testimony of Joe Salerno. Not everything in the war ends in success. We have losses, and that was one of them.
Salerno's testimony would eventually contribute to the toppling of Scarfo. But for now, Nicodemo Scarfo appeared untouchable and would soon become the uncontested boss of Atlantic City. 1 week after the murder of Phil Testa in March of 1981, the ruling commission of La Cosa Nostra gave Scarfo their blessings to become boss of the Philadelphia Atlantic City family.
Tomorrow night, we will continue our look into the world of the South Jersey mob as we explore the reign of little Nicky Scarfo.
As we continue our series on disorganized crime, we explore the reign of Nicodemo Scarfo tonight, who in 1981 was named Don of Atlantic City. Scarfo lived a lavish lifestyle. No wonder. According to underboss Phil Leonetti's testimony after he turned informant, Local 54 president Frank Gerace, skimming off the union's welfare plan, paid Scarfo $20,000 a month. A number of bars and restaurants protected by Scarfo from Local 54 paid him $500 a week, and Scarfo ate for free at Scanicchio's. Jerry Blavitt of Memories even paid the mortgage on Scarfo's boat. Although little Nicky was not a big gambler, he was comped like a high roller at many of the casinos, generally enjoying the good life of a man with power. The theory of Scarfo's succession to power was that he allowed the New York families to operate here also, as long as he was deemed Don of the resort. The man many had dismissed as a two-bit punk had transformed into a masterful mafioso. Fellow mobsters flocked to the resort to pay their respects and live the high life with Scarfo. Capo Thomas Del Giorno lived here at Ocean Colony in Ocean City. But inside this condo, while the mobsters were talking, the cops were listening. The New Jersey State Police bugged Del Giorno's place and moved several female undercover officers into the complex to listen in on Del Giorno's poolside chats. After 2 years of surveillance, the police pulled in Del Giorno. He would become the first high-ranking member of La Cosa Nostra to turn informant.
When Del Giorno was confronted with those tapes and realized that Scarfo was ready to do him in, I think that was the initial major breakthrough in the downfall of the Scarfo organization.
The Ocean City surveillance would eventually lead to the downfall of Scarfo. But for 2 years, the state police bug went undetected. And during that time, little Nicky's biggest obstacle appeared to come in the form of a hunchback, barely 5 feet tall.
Harry the Hunchback Riccobene was a longtime Bruno ally who had refused to acknowledge Scarfo as boss. The Scarfo street war with Riccobene was the bloodiest of his reign. In the end, 15 of 20 Riccobene soldiers would be killed in this battle, which failed to claim the 4'10" mobster himself, who managed to survive 2 hits, including one in which he was shot at a point-blank range while sitting in his car and emerged unscathed.
He drove out to his house, and in his driveway was this car that was blown to bits, and I made a comment that they tried to kill you again. Harry says, "Oh, no, what makes you say that?" I said, "Well, Harry," I said, "there's bullet holes all over your car." And Harry made a sarcastic remark to the effect, "Well, the vandals in this neighborhood are just horrible, Mr. Friel." I said, "But Harry, it looks like you've got a graze across the top of your skull." And Harry said, "Oh, no," he says, "I bumped my head going in the door." Well, as I said, Harry's 4'10", the door's about 7 foot.
Scarfo emerged from the Riccobene Wars here in South Philadelphia victorious. The bloodshed of the 80s and the passing of the old guard made it possible for a new generation of mobster to emerge, a younger, untested version, a factor which would eventually lead to Scarfo's downfall.
One of those young soldiers was Sal Testa, son of the late mob boss. Scarfo felt that with his growing power, Testa would someday emerge as a threat and may not wait for a period of natural ascension. So Scarfo ordered that he be killed, something easier said than done. It would take a half-dozen tries, including one in Ocean City, before they would get it right.
The conspiracy that eventually led to Sal Testa's death is almost comical because it reminds you of the old book, The Gang That Couldn't Shoot Straight, because they tried innumerable attempts to kill Sal Testa and were eventually successful in 1984.
But the tide would begin to turn on Scarfo when Tommy Del Giorno was confronted with those surveillance tapes from his Ocean City condo.
There's very little doubt that when those tapes were played for Del Giorno by the New Jersey State Police investigators, he realized the jig was up. It was time to make your best deal. Let's cut our losses and run.
As informant, Thomas Del Giorno would get his first major shot at his former boss in the murder trial of Salvatore Testa. However, this case, which appeared to be airtight against Scarfo, ended in a not guilty verdict, leaving law enforcement officials baffled and wondering, would they ever be able to get Scarfo?
A point we'll explore tomorrow night in Part 3 of Disorganized Crime. Tonight we continue our probe into the world of organized crime in South Jersey with a look at the downfall of Nicky Scarfo.
A downfall that would set in motion a series of events that would reach far into other organized crime families. Tonight in Part 3 of our series Disorganized Crime, we begin with Scarfo's last big break before his reign as Don would come to an end.
Devastated, absolutely devastated. It was the absolute low point of my career in law enforcement.
The point to which Frank Friel speaks was Scarfo's not guilty verdict in the Sal Testa murder case, a verdict which left law enforcement officials wondering if they would ever be able to get Scarfo on something long-term. a point flaunted by Scarfo himself, who sent Friel a special thanks for his help in the trial. Law enforcement officials, however, would get the last laugh in the form of a RICO case that would allow them to try Scarfo on a laundry list of charges, evidence gathered in large part through the help of the New Jersey State Police.
I'm proud of that fact. It was the fact that a New Jersey detective, Lieutenant Ed Johnson, was the one that turned Tom Del Giorno, and as a result of that, 5 additional members turned, and that was really the demise of Scarfo and most of his hierarchy.
The testimony of Del Giorno and others in the Scarfo family against the boss enabled the feds to charge Nicky with crimes dating back to the 1970s under the far-reaching RICO statute, including the murders of Summers Point Municipal Court Judge Edwin Helfant, mobster Vincent Falcone, and Capo Saltesta. After a month of testimony and 2 days of deliberation in the trial, the verdict was in. Scarfo was found guilty of 8 of the 9 murders against him and sentenced to 55 years in prison. Law enforcement had finally won. But just because Scarfo was losing his freedom didn't mean he was losing control.
But even locked up, authorities alleged that Scarfo still controlled his biggest asset in Atlantic City, Local 54.
The Department of Justice has today filed a civil racketeering suit against the 22,000-member local.
The suit alleged the Atlantic City, Philadelphia crime family had controlled Local 54 from the beginning.
There hadn't been a contested election since 1976. In 1979, there wasn't a contested election, and the people who ran for office were visited by Scarfo associates, and they were told they would be shot if they ran for office against Scarfo.
The government charged that Scarfo had robbed benefit funds, extorted businesses, and ordered the murder of Philadelphia Union leader John McCullough. The suit relied heavily on the depositions of underbosses Phil Leonetti, Lawrence Merlino, and former Local 54 business agent Joseph Arrace. All testified that the jailed Scarfo used son Nicky Jr. as a Local 54 liaison and handpicked President Roy Silbert.
The officers of Local 54 will be required to resign effective June 1, 1991.
A court-appointed monitor now runs the union to root out corruption. But just this month, Local 54 members voted down the monitor's suggested changes in bylaws, changes the government says are necessary to keep out organized crime.
We have to look at it again and see whether or not there is another way that we can structure the union so that the organized crime people don't get an opportunity to come back. The goal and the desire to have a control of this union is so great, there's so much money that's involved here, that we're always going to have people who want to take over this union and security guards, dealers, other unions that have the ability to affect the way the casino operates.
But for now, the government is satisfied they have broken the ties between Local 54 and Nicodemos Scarfo. Tomorrow night, we'll examine what law officials think led to the demise of the Scarfo crime family and who they believe is now controlling the Philadelphia Atlantic City mob.
Meanwhile, South Jersey mob boss Little Nicky Scarfo is currently serving a 55-year sentence in federal prison for a 1988 racketeering conviction.
Last week, Scarfo won a new trial in the murder of Frankie Flowers D'Alfonso, a trial that made Scarfo the first Don in the history of organized crime to be convicted of first-degree murder. But no matter what the outcome of the new trial, Scarfo is in prison on federal charges for life. Tonight, as John and I conclude our series, Disorganized Crime, we examine Scarfo's failed leadership style and explore who is controlling the South Jersey mob now.
He was certainly a killer without conscience, a killer without remorse.
Nicodemos Scarfo was the bloodiest mob boss since Al Capone, killing for reasons beyond the Mafia's traditional code of business. He murdered to intimidate and to calm his own paranoia over threats to his throne, such as his own capo, Salvatore Testa. During his reign, Scarfo ordered 24 mob hits. Authorities believe it was Little Nicky's bloodthirsty style that led to his downfall. When he turned on his own family members, they turned to the law.
Once his violence and his willingness to inflict punishment on his own members became well known, that certainly provided great encouragement for other members of his family when they were confronted by law enforcement of their own potential demise to be much more willing to give up their allegiance to Scarfo and to think of themselves.
Those familiar with organized crime believe Scarfo's violent leadership watered down the gene pool of the Philadelphia Atlantic City mob, leaving those capable of running the organization either dead or in the witness protection program.
The organization runs according to the skill and expertise of its members. The guy at the top very seldom gets involved in the mechanic work. And when you start to systematically eliminate the mechanics, then the whole organization begins to fall. It begins to crumble.
Scarfo brought his own downfall as a result of his management style. He was too greedy, he was too vicious.
The demise of the Scarfo crime family has now opened up the Philadelphia Atlantic City underworlds to the expanding interest of New York and Sicilian mafia kingpins. So who is controlling the Philadelphia Atlantic City mob? Who, if anyone, is operating for La Cosa Nostra in this casino resort of fast money? One name law enforcement officials toss around is Sicilian John Stanfa.
Now, John Stanfa is no stranger to organized crime officials. He first came to their attention back in March of 1980 when he drove then mob boss Angelo Bruno to his home here in the 900 block of Snyder Avenue in South Philadelphia. It was outside of his home as the two men sat conversing in the car that Angelo Bruno was brutally murdered.
And some law enforcement officials say with Stanfa in control, with the backing of both the Sicilian Mafia and the American LCN, the sky is the limit.
He's in a position to build it up because he can bring Sicilians into that organization. He seems to have made peace with all the warring factions within the organization. He's a low-key individual. He's not a Scarfo type, and he's not violent prone. I think he's more of a businessman. I predict that that's going to become a more powerful family than when Scarfo had it.
Now, because of the heavy emphasis on narcotics, Dentino sees Stanfa shying away from Atlantic City, creating yet again an open territory.
Right now, we don't know. Atlantic City is basically up for grabs. I mean, people from New York and Philadelphia and everyone who has an interest in here will get their own piece of the pie if they can, and they'll do whatever they can to be able to control whatever portion of the city and of the industries and the money that's to be made.
For as long as people want narcotics, for as long as they want loan shark money, for as long as they want other types of illicit things, illegal gambling, there will be an organized enterprise that will provide those services.
The fall of Nicky Scarfo and Gambino crime boss John Gotti marked the end of what the head of the Pennsylvania Crime Commission called the mob's high-profile cowboys, but barely put a dent into the mob itself, a point echoed by many law enforcement officials.
To believe that the mob has been crippled beyond redemption is foolhardy indeed. Law enforcement has to certainly remain especially vigilant now to prevent the mob from reaching the position that it enjoyed going back into the early 80s, where it could literally kill with impunity.
And that seems to be the difference between organized crime of the 70s and 80s and the 90s, the ability to corrupt the system.
Corruption was one of the cornerstones of the LCN, not only in Philadelphia but everywhere, and that particular facet of any of the other ethnic organizations just doesn't seem to be there at this point.
But whether organized or disorganized, there will always be criminal activity in Atlantic City.
Willie Sutton robbed banks because that's where the money is. Organized crime is going to be in the casinos because that's where the money is. And you're always going to have them here.
Now, as an illustration of the current openness of Atlantic City, indictments were recently handed down in New Jersey against several high-ranking members of the Genovese crime family out of New York.
Indictments which charge them with, among other crimes, attempting to secure the contracts for the construction of the new Atlantic City International Airport.